Memory is when you look back and the answers float into who, what, when, where. The members who were there then are repeated on a screen, are recalled on a scroll, are moved in a miniature drama, are collected and recollected for actions, speeches, silences, set forth by images of the mind and made in a mingling mist to do again and to do over precisely what they did do once. This is memory. Sometimes slurred and blurred, this is remembering. Sometimes wrecking the images and proceeding again to reconstruct what happened and how. To many little involved answers to who, what, when, where. And more involved than any, how did it happen? The title of the book, always the Young Stangers, from a poem, Broken-Faced Gargoyles, in the book Smoke and Steel. All I can give you now is broken-faced gargoyles. All I can give you now is a double gorilla head with 2 fish mouths and 4 eagle eyes hooked on a street wall, spouting water and looking 2 ways to the ends of the street for the new people, the young strangers, coming, always coming. It is early, I shall yet be footloose. A big unseen bell goes bong. Knots come loose. Long woven bonds break from their folds and clutches. The mother saying while tugs and struggles in her womb say, my time too has come, when she says it is my time now. There is a tearing asunder of every last hold and bond, the violence of leaving the 9-month home to enter a second and vastly larger home. In the mother and the child, the crashes and explosions go on, a series leading to the final expulsion. Not till then can there be a birth certificate, a name and a christening, a savage small mouth tugging at pink nipples. I was born a little after midnight, my mother told me. A Swedish midwife had been at hand early in the evening. She cut the umbilical cord, tended to the afterbirth, did her responsible duties, and was praised for her skill. This was in a 3-room frame house on 3rd Street, the second house east of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad tracks in Galesburg, Illinois, January 6, 1878. Exactly 100 years earlier, on January 6, Thomas Lincoln, the father of Abraham Lincoln, was born, and the coincidences of these births don't mean a thing, except that the odd facts stick in the mind even though they prove nothing. My father was a black Swede, his hair straight and black, his eyes black with a hint of brown, eyes rather deep set in the bone, and the skin crinkled with his smile or laugh. He was somewhat below medium height, weighing about 148, well-muscled, the skin of his chest showing a pale white against the grime when his collar was turned down. He was at the CB&Q blacksmith shop, rated as a helper the year round, No vacations. Leaving home at 6:45 in the morning, walking to arrive at the Q shop at 7, never late, mauling away at engine and car parts till 12 noon. He walked home, ate the noon dinner, walked back to the shop to begin work at 1, and go on till the 6 o'clock whistle. Then he stood sledge alongside Annabel and walked home after his 10-hour day. His hands thick with calluses, he was strictly a horny-handed son of toil, you might say. It would take him 10 or 15 minutes to get the soot and grime off hands, face, and neck. He poured the cistern rainwater from a tin pail into a tin basin on a washstand, twice throwing the used water into a tin pail on the floor before the final delicious rinsing at a third basin of the water that had run off the roof into the cistern. The calluses inside his hands were intricate with hollows and fissures. To dig out the black grit from the deep cracks took longer than any part of the washing. Even then, there were black lines of smudge that failed to come out. Then came supper, and often his favorite meat, pork chops fried well done. In late spring, summer, and early fall, he would often work in the garden till after dark. More than one night in October, picking tomatoes and digging potatoes by the light of a moon. In the colder months, he always found something to fix or improve in walls, floors, chairs, tables, the stove, the coal shed, the cistern, the pump. He liked to sew patches on his jeans pants or his work coat, having his own strong thread and large needle for replacing lost buttons. In those early years, he read a weekly paper from Chicago, Himlandet, the Swedish for homeland. Regularly, he or the mother read aloud to each other and the children at night from the Swedish Bible. And the mother, young Clara Matilda Anderson, who had married my father, what was she like? She had fair hair between blonde and brown, the color of oat straw just before the sun tans it. Eyes light blue, the skin white as fresh linen by candlelight. The mouth for smiling. She had 10 smiles for us to 1 from our father. Her nose recessive, retroussé, not snub. Her full and rich white breasts, how can I forget them? Having seen the babies one by one, year on year, nursing at them. Having seen her leave the wash tub to take up a crying child and feed it and go back to the wash tub. She was 5 feet 5 inches in height, weighing perhaps 140, tireless muscles on her bones, tireless about her housework. She did the cooking, washing, sewing, bed making, and house cleaning for the family of 9 persons as the children had come. At 6 o'clock in the morning, she was up to get breakfast for her man, later breakfast for the children, and meals for all again at noon and at evening. Always clothes to be patched, the boys sometimes wearing out a 3rd seat of trousers and having the other kids hollering when the shirt tails stuck out, "The letter in the post office for you." And as we got into long pants, the knees always needed patching. Playing marbles in the spring, wrestling and scuffling, we wore holes at the knees of pants, going bare at the knees till Mama patched them. That was always our name for her when we spoke to her or of her in the family circle. The father always called her Clara, spoken in Swedish as Clara. My father wrote no letters. He did no writing at all. He had never learned to write. When his father and mother died in Sweden, his schooling had only taught him to read, and he earned some kind of a living as chore boy in a distillery. He became a teamster at the distillery, finally laying by enough money to buy steerage passage to America, to what he called the new country where there was a better chance. I am sure that while I was still in dresses, not yet in my first pair of pants, I used only Swedish words and sentences to tell what I was wanting. I would say, "Jag vill ha vatten." I want a drink of water. or "Jag är varm," I am warm. I said "far" before I learned the word father, and "mor" before I learned to say mother. The English words for things to eat and wear: mjölk for milk, bröd or bread, sko for shoe, strumper, stockings, my little tongue picked up after I was out of dresses. There was an early day when I looked out of a window in the South Street house and saw the ground white and more of the white coming down, and my mother nodded toward it and said with a smile, "Snö." It was the first snow I ever saw with a name to it. The word skratta came early. I was saying skratta sooner than I said laugh. They mean the same, but I have always felt that skratta comes out of the mouth with more of a funny twist than the English word laugh. I would guess there were 200 or 300 words I learned in Swedish before I learned them in English. I believe one thing that has happened to me in the world of language, other millions of good American citizens have known. There are words that we no longer use. Those words belong to the language of a foreign country. In a way you might call them lost words. We use them and say them over sometimes when talking with those who, like us, feel something warm and cozy about those words because we knew them so well in our early years. I was 7.5 years old when General Ulysses S. Grant died, and I went to his funeral. He had died somewhere away far off from Galesburg. I didn't hear where, and they didn't bring his body to Galesburg, but Main Street stores closed for the afternoon, and the Q shops and the Brown Corn Planter Works and Frost's Foundry shut down for the afternoon. A parade began at the Q Depot on Seminary Street and moved to Main Street, turned west, and marched to the public square. They said it was the longest parade Galesburg had ever seen. The 5 long blocks of Main Street sidewalks from Seminary to the square on both sides of the street were crowded with people. A hot July afternoon in 1885. My father had been pushed and squeezed and had done some pushing and squeezing himself till at last we stood about 3 or 4 feet from the curb in front of the big O.T. Johnson dry goods store. It was good they had made me put on shoes and stockings, because the way I got tramped on would have been worse if I had been barefoot. I tried to see the parade looking between the legs of men ahead of me, but all I saw was more and more legs of more men. I pulled my father's hand and blubbered, "I can't see, I can't see." My father lifted me up, stuck his head between my legs, and there I sat straddle of him, and only a giant could see the parade better than I could. There was a marshal of the parade on a skittish sorrel horse with a shiny bridle and with brass buttons, each bigger than a silver dollar, on the saddle. The marshal rode at the head of the parade and made people know they ought not to get in the way of the parade. Then came 2 rows of policemen with nickel-plated stars shining on their blue coats. Each had a belt with a club hanging from it, and they marched with straight faces as though they could take care of any trouble that might come up. Then came a fife and drum corps. It seemed the pounding noise they made was shaking the buildings, and I took a better grip on my father's hat to make sure I wouldn't fall off. Then came a long line of men dressed like they might be going to church on Sunday, keeping their faces straight like they were in church, marching 4 in a row. The Galesburg Marine Band marched past, men walking, and their mouths blowing into their horns as they walked. The first time I had seen anything like it. One man had a big horn that seemed to be wrapped around him, and I was puzzled how he got into it. They had on blue coats and pants, and the stripes down the sides of the pants. The stripe was either red or yellow and looked pretty. Their music was slow and sad. General Grant was dead, and this was part of his funeral, and the music should be sad. It was only 20 years since the war ended, and General Grant was the greatest general in war, they told me. and they wanted to show they were sad because he was dead. That was the feeling I had, and I could see there were many others had this same feeling. Marching past came men wearing dark blue coats and big black hats tied round with a little cord of what looked like gold with a knot and a little tassel. They were the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, and I heard that some of these men had seen General Grant and had been in the war with him and could tell how he looked on a horse and what made him a great general. 8 or 10 of these GAR men walked along the sides of a long black box on some kind of a black car pulled by 8 black horses. The body of General Grant wasn't in the box, but somewhere far away, General Grant was being buried in a box like this one. I could see everybody around was more quiet when this part of the parade passed. I remember 1 or 2 cannon came past with 6 or 8 horses pulling them. The Negro Silver Cornet Band marched. Their music, too, was slow and sad. I saw them with the only black faces from the beginning to the end of the parade, and as they passed, I saw faces of men and women light up, though they didn't smile. I had heard from my father that the war where Grant was the big general was a war for the black people to be free. I didn't quite understand what it was for people to be not free, to be whipped and worked hard and bought and sold like horses. There was nothing like it in Galesburg or Knox County, but whatever it was terrible, and men would shake their heads talking about it. So there was something people liked about seeing the black men with their horns playing sad music, because General Grant, who had helped them get free, was dead. A big flag was swinging high over the man carrying it. The end of the pole holding the flag came to some kind of a pocket the man had in a belt around his middle. It looked heavy to carry, and I could see the sweat rolling on the puffed-out cheeks of the chunky man carrying a flag that went away high over him. The parade was different from other parades I had seen. I had seen a circus parade and people on the sidewalks laughing and hollering at the clowns and elephants and wild animals in cages. I had seen the Republican rally parade with torchlights, and Democrats on the sidewalks hooting the Republicans marching, and the Republicans hooting back. But in this General Grant funeral parade, there was no laughing, no hooting. The men marching had straight faces, and so did the people on the sidewalks. Except the 2 bands and the fife and drum corps and the sound of feet and horse hoofs and wheels on the street stones, you couldn't hear much of anything. Even the slow, sad music the bands played seemed quiet. I had heard those bands play Yankee Doodle and Pop Goes the Weasel, and they made you feel like running and hollering. I didn't see any boys running or hollering. What 3 or 4 boys and girls I saw stood still in their foot tracks, watching the parade go past. They shifted their feet a little when the marshal's horse acted skittish, as though it might run up on a sidewalk full of people. The children stood with straight faces like the old folks. They knew, like I did, that it was a day that meant something. How hard I tried to think about what the war was and what General Grant did that made him the greatest general of all. I heard that he had been the president, the head man of the government in Washington, and now since he was dead and somewhere far away they were laying him in a coffin in the cold ground, he would never come back to be a great general in a war again, and he would never be president and head man of the government in Washington again. I heard, too, that he was one of the high men of the Republican Party, and the Republicans would miss him. I heard, too, that there were some Democrats who had been in the war with General Grant, and they liked the way he did things and the way he treated them, and these Democrats were sorry along with the Republicans. My father kept his hands on my feet and legs, and I think the only smile I saw while the parade was passing was once when my father turned his face up toward me and felt good over the way he had fixed it so I could see the parade. It was nearly like being in church, the way the people kept still and never smiled while the parade passed. But it wasn't like being in church to look at a pretty girl in a pink dress near us. She was about my size. She stood on the sidewalk edge, maybe 3 feet in front of my father and me. She looked puzzled when she saw me away up there, high over her and straddling my father's neck and shoulders. Then she went on looking at the parade. Several times I took my eyes off the parade and watched what she was doing. Her right hand would go down somewhere and come up and put something in her mouth, and I could see her mouth working. Then I saw what she was putting in her mouth. Peanuts. I couldn't see her hands shelling the peanuts, but that was what she was doing. While the parade was passing, she must have chewed and swallowed half a 5-cent sack, maybe a whole sack, of peanuts. 2 or 3 times she turned her head, and I caught her looking up to see if I was where she saw me the last time, as if I might fall off, and if I did, she didn't want to miss it. She went right on chewing peanuts while she looked at me. And when she turned her head back to see the parade, I could see her jaws working and her hand going down for more peanuts to shell and put in her mouth. She had a pretty face, and her pink dress seemed to go with her face. The parade was about half over when I said to myself I would watch the parade and not let her bother me. When the parade was nearly over, I did sneak a look toward her, and when she caught me watching her jaws wagging, I made an ugly face at her. I never saw her again. My father let me down from his neck and shoulders. We walked along Main Street among thousands of people, and now you could see a smile once in a while. Boys snickering and bumping each other. We walked home. I could see it was a day that meant something to my father, but he didn't tell me. In some store windows I noticed pictures of General Grant with black cloth hung around them. I couldn't see where he looked so different from other men that I had seen, with whiskers over the whole face and the hairs cut close. He didn't look much different from Mr. Grubb, the Lombard professor who lived across the street from us, and every morning milked his cow before going to the college. And then I said to myself that even though Professor Grubb's face was nearly exactly like General Grant's face, if he should die, there wouldn't be any such parade as we had seen for General Grant. I went to bed that night saying I hoped sometime I would know more about the war, about the black people made free, about Grant the general and what it was like to be president and the head man of the government in Washington. When the face of the pretty girl chewing peanuts came back to me for half a minute, I gave her an ugly look. And later her face came back again, and she gave me an ugly look. And I was so tired, I went to sleep without making any kind of a face back at her. In the house on Berrien Street, we had a pump in the backyard, wooden, and it had a wooden handle. I became part of the pump, and the pump became part of me. When I hated and cursed the pump, I took it back afterward and said I was sorry. I came to like that pump for all its faults. When I scolded it and snarled at it, it never answered back. The pump went on doing what it had to do while I did what I had to do. The pump stood about 15 steps from the door of the stairs going down from the back door of the house. I took an empty galvanized iron pail from the side of the kitchen sink, opened the door to the back hall, opened the back door and went down the stairs and then to the pump. I set the pail under the pump spout, put my 2 hands on the pump handle, pushed the handle down, pulled the handle up, and went on pumping till water poured out of the spout and filled the pail. Then I carried the pail to the back stairs, up the stairs to the back door, the hall, the kitchen door, and the kitchen sink. I did this 1,000 times at least, or it could have been 2,000 or 3,000 times. Others in the house did this same chore sometimes, but I was counted the oldest boy, the handy, strong boy who was called on. What we brought into the house was fresh water, or in Swedish, friskt vatten. In the warm months, water standing in a pail an hour or 2 didn't taste good, and the call was for fresh water, the father saying, "Friskt vatten, Charlie." In a summer dry spell, when the pump handle came up light and loose, pulling up no water, I knew the water was low at the bottom of the well and the pump needed priming. I would go back to the kitchen and get a pail of cistern rainwater, pouring it down to the leather sucker and the tubing. Then I would push and pull at the pump handle till at last the pump spout was running glad and free and saying, "Here's your water." And on hot, sweltering summer days when butter melted and stayed melted in the kitchen, Mother would put it in a small tin pail, tie a doubled grocery string to the handle, and I would lift the cover of the well platform and let the butter down to become cool and hard again. There were winter mornings when my hands in mittens went round the pump handle and I pushed and pulled and couldn't budge it. They would be watching me from the kitchen window. They saw me skipping back to the kitchen. They were ready with a pail of hot water. I poured this down the pump, sometimes ran back to the kitchen for a second pail of hot water. After the pump was thawed, I pumped and carried in 2 pails of water to last the family till the next morning, when again we thawed out the pump and primed it. And this, of course, meant carrying in extra pails of water from the cistern where there was no pump, and you let down your galvanized iron pail and broke the thin ice and pulled the pail up with a rope. I got acquainted with the difference between a freshwater well and a rainwater system. 3 or 4 times it happened I would push and pull at the pump handle and no water came. Papa looked it over and said it needed a new sucker. He cut leather and shaped a new sucker. He let me down into the well on a rope, told me what to do, and stood looking down, telling me what more to do. I was glad when he pulled me up and we could say the pump was fixed and the new sucker worked. It was a good pump, and whenever it didn't work, it had a good excuse, and you couldn't blame it. Why did my father, with his exceptional manual cleverness and variety of skills, never learn to write? Had he cared to will to write, he could have learned to write the letters of all the words he knew. The desire wasn't there. He never cared for books. Life seemed to have enough stories for him without storybooks. In our early childhood years, he read to us from the Swedish Bible, but seldom till later years did we see him spend hours or half hours reading it for companionship. And seldom did he quote from the Bible. If he had had even a surface desire to write, he could have learned from his wife or from any of his children with only a few nights of fooling around with the shaping of letters. At the blacksmith shop, the railroad blacksmith shop, he could take a crude oblong of steel and grind and sharpen it into a fine blade, which he fitted into a wooden handle he had carved, thus making a knife he designed, this being more important to him than reading in books about knives. He could install an iron sink and fit the drain pipes for it, or replace a broken door hinge or lock, or put in a window pane and smooth the putty secure, or pull out a crumbling part of a brick foundation and lay in new brick and mortar into a fairly finished piece of masonry work. He never hungered to write. We never heard him speak of feeling the need of it. He was the type of illiterate you can meet occasionally in the journals of Thoreau and Emerson. Each had curiosity about and respect for certain neighbors who managed to live well enough without reading or writing. The mother had ways and habits quite different from the father. Though she seldom kissed the children, she often gave a pat on the cheek or on the head, along with a beaming smile, which the father almost never did. I used to think that when he had an impulse to praise me for holding a kerosene lamp 2 hours to light him on a carpentry repair job, he checked the impulse, having decided that I would believe I was worth more than I was. Later it came clear to me he had no such impulse. He was doing his work and I was doing mine, and when we were through, and there was no call for words unless about something gone wrong. He could no more speak praise than he could sing. The mother, however, couldn't keep from saying nice things when we did anything well. Whether it was schoolwork or learning the catechism or hanging out sheets and shirts on a cold winter day, she would speak thanks or say I was a good boy. She could give a sudden pinch on an arm with her strong right hand, and those pinches and what few slaps she gave me were fair. I deserved them and never held it against her, as I did the powerful side fist of my father when he hit me. Both were earnest persons, though the mother would often laugh at our childish pranks and fooling, while the father would keep a straight face or scowl. We knew he was taking life in hard ways. As the years passed, there came by slow growth layers of muscle making a hump on his right shoulder. He was day on day swinging sledges and hammers on hot iron on an anvil. We knew him for a strong man who could hold up his end on a piece of work. But we saw him many an evening come home after the 10-hour day, his shirt soaked with sweat, and he had no word nor murmur, though he looked fagged and worn. After washing, he would slump into a chair as though now every bone and muscle in his body could be glad and easy. When a muscle was sore, he would rub it with camphor oil. When his stomach was out of order, he would take 2 or 3 drops of camphor in a spoon of coffee. When he had a cold, he would give himself camphor smells from a bottle. At times when we had lump sugar, he would eat a lump with 2 or 3 drops of camphor to add flavor. Mama, always on wash day, took off from the 3rd finger of the left hand her wedding ring of 18-karat gold, a plain and simple band. She said my hand is better for washing with the ring off. She placed it high on a cupboard shelf. The washing done, the ring came back on her hand. Only on Blue Monday did that ring come off. It was a token of a true love that lasted, never went on the rocks for all the storms that shook it. Her man could scold and rage, his deep, passionate baritone crying out over some waste of money, some breakage or spoilage, a door left open, a broken jug and molasses or sorghum making a mess, a plaything carelessly smashed, a chair gone bust. He would blame the children and then blame Mama for not training or watching the children. Her cue was to say nothing. Let him go from room to room, upstairs and down, and usually in 10 minutes he had worn off his anger. Mama's wedding ring was never lost, was always on that finger as placed there with pledges years ago. It was a sign and seal of something that ran deep and held fast between the two of them. They had chosen each other as partners. How they happened to meet I heard only from my mother. I had asked her how they came to marry, and she said, I was working in a hotel in Bushnell, Illinois, making the beds and helping in the kitchen. I came to Bushnell with the railroad gang. He came to the hotel and saw me, and we talked, and he said he wanted to marry me. I saw it was my chance, and soon went to Galesburg, and the Reverend Lindahl married us, and we started housekeeping. A smile spread over her face, half bashful, and a bright light in her blue eyes as she said, I saw it was my chance. She was saying this at least 20 years after the wedding, and there had been hard work always, tough luck at times. 7 children, of whom 2 had died on the same day from diphtheria. And she had not one regret that she had jumped at her chance when she saw it. One sheet of paper kept as sacred over the years was a certificate signed by S.P.A. Lindahl that on the 7th day of August, Anno Domini 1874, in Galesburg, they were, quote, united in marriage by me. In school in those days, we wrote spelling and arithmetic lessons on slates with slate pencils. A slate filled up with writing on both sides, and we took a wet sponge or rag, wiped off the writing, and had a clean slate. Some boys spit on their slates and wiped them dry on their sleeves. Along about the 3rd or 4th grade, we quit slates for paper. One boy said he didn't like the change because he couldn't spit on the paper and wipe off the writing. We bought penny or nickel tablets. At our house, we saved a few pennies and nickels a year by using the wrapping paper from the grocery or the butcher shop. Under Miss Maggie Mullen, I got straightened out about the earth. I had been going along with the idea that the earth is flat. I had been here and there a few miles out of Galesburg, and I had never noticed the earth was anything but flat. But few times I had heard older people or preachers say the round world or the globe, I didn't ask questions. Now I had a geography, and it said that men had sailed around this ball, the earth. These men on sailing ships had started west and kept sailing west, and after weeks or months of sailing west, they came back to the same place they started from. And if the earth was flat, if it wasn't a ball, how could that be? I had never seen any ships or any ocean, but I believed the book. I made the picture in my mind many times, how if you watch a ship sailing out to sea away from you, after a while you can't see the sides and hull of the ship, and only the sails are in sight. Little by little they go out of sight, and there is no sign of a ship. Then I would put myself on the ship and watch the land fade out of sight. This was the first sailing I did on the Illinois prairie. Then came a couple of stunners. The book said an axis runs through the globe, and at one end is the North Pole, and at the other end the South Pole, and the globe turns on this axis every 24 hours. We get daylight when the globe is turned toward the sun, and it's night where any side of the earth is not getting the sun. When it's daylight in Galesburg, it's nighttime in China on the other side of the globe. Other boys like myself went to bed at night saying, "Now the sun is shining in China, the other side of the earth." We liked the equator, that belt around the outside center of the earth, and how it's warm for the people there because they get more sun. We wondered whether we would like to be Eskimos up near the North Pole, where they have daylight 6 months straight, and then it's night the next 6 months. Summer we had because the sun was near, and winter because the sun moved off farther. I hugged my geography and called it the best book yet. It made me read the sky and the weather as though they were books. In our reader was a piece about a stonemason. He was one of a gang of workmen who had finished building a high water tower. They had pulled down all the ropes, and he was left alone up on top of the tower, and there didn't seem to be any way for him to get down. Nobody had an idea. Then from the crowd down below, his wife cupped her hands and said, "Unravel your sock, John." She was a smart woman, the only one with an idea. John unraveled his sock, let the yarn down, and pulled up a cord. With the cord he pulled up a rope and slid down the rope to his wife, who hugged him and said, "Bless you, John." What the class had fun with was cupping our hands around our mouths and calling to someone away up there, "Unravel your sock, John." Some called it clear and loud so John could have heard it. Others called it so fast John wouldn't have known what they were saying. Others were afraid how their voices might sound, and they wouldn't have reached John. There were later days on Berrien Street when we had play and sport in front of our house. One tender and curious memory stands out. The house next east to ours, straight across the street, was an average 2-story frame affair with a porch perhaps 15 feet long. In this street, in front of this house, was our home base when playing ball. Often we saw on that porch, in a rocking chair, a little old woman, her hair snow-white with the years. She had a past, a rather bright, though not dazzling past, you might say. She could lay claim to fame if she chose. Millions of children reading the McGuffey and other school readers had met her name and memorized lines she had written. For there was in the course of her years no short poem in the English language more widely published, known, and recited than her lines about little things. Little drops of water, little grains of sand, make the mighty ocean and a pleasant land. Little deeds of kindness, little words of love, help to make earth happy like the heaven above. She was Julia Carney, her sons Fletcher and James being Universalists and Lombard College graduates, Fletcher serving 3 or 4 terms as mayor of Galesburg. There she sat in the quiet of her backward-gazing thoughts, sometimes gently rocking, while we hooted and yelled over hits, runs, put-outs. There she sat, an image of silence and rest, while the air rang with boy screams. "Hit it bang on the nose now!" "Ah, he couldn't hit a balloon." Down went McGinty to the bottom of the sea. Rarely she turned her head to see what we were doing. She made no request for the benefit of those who have retired. To us at that time, she was just one more nice old woman who wouldn't bother boys at play. We didn't know that her writings were in books and newspaper reprints that reached millions of readers. The Carneys were good neighbors, and she was one of them. That was all we knew. We should have heard about her in school. We should have read little pieces about her in the papers. She has a tiny, quaint niche in the history of American literature under which one line could be written. She loved children and wrote poems she hoped children would love. As late as the year 1952, Mrs. Dwight D. Eisenhower, in a magazine article, quoted the poem Little Things as one of her childhood delights. When the circus came to town, we managed to shake out of sleep at 4 o'clock in the morning, grab a slice of bread and butter, and make a fast walk to the CB&Q railroad yards to watch the unloading in early daylight. A grand, clear voice the man had who rode his horse a half a block ahead of the elephants in the parade and cried out as though there might be hell to pay, "The elephants are coming, watch your horses!" First to one side of the street and then the other he cried it, and those who had skittish horses watched them. After the unloading in the morning, we went home for a quick breakfast and a run to the circus grounds, a big pasture at Main and Farnham near the city limits. If we were lucky, we got jobs at carrying water for the elephants or lugging to the big tent the boards for the audience to sit on. After 3 or 4 hours of this useful and necessary work, we were presented with slips of paper that let us in to see the big show in the afternoon. If we hadn't been lucky, or if we didn't have the 50 cents for a ticket, we tried to slide under the canvas and crawl to where we could peek through the boards and between legs to see the grand march, the acrobats, the trapezists, the clowns, the hippodrome chariot race given before our eyes as it was in the time of Nero in Rome. Once, as I was nearly through the canvas, a pair of strong hands caught me by the ankles, yanked me out, and threw me for a fall, and a voice told me I could get the hell out of there. I walked around to the sideshow. There, out front, as a free show, I saw the man with the elastic skin. He would pull it out from his face and neck, and it would snap back into place. There I saw the tattooed man with fish, birds, brunette girls, ships, and many other shapes inked deep into his skin. And there, too, the Oriental dancing girl, wearing few clothes and smiling about it to some giggling farm hands. The spieler, a man with a thick, up-curled mustache, leaned toward the farm hands and said in a voice as if for them only to hear, "Go inside, boys. Get inside. You can't lose. She takes off everything, every last stitch, and her muscles shake like a bowl of jelly. She makes a sick man feel like a wild monkey. What did you come here for, boys? She's got it. You can't lose." Then the spieler dropped his confidential way and turned to the main crowd and let go in a smooth, loud voice. You could tell he was used to what he was saying, and he had spoken the same words in the same way 1,000 times. "Ladies and gentlemen, beneath yon canvas we have the curiosities and the monstrosities, the wild man of Borneo, the smallest dwarf ever seen of mankind, and the tallest giant that ever came into existence, the most marvelous snake ever brought to your city, a man-eating python captured in the darkest jungles of Africa ever penetrated by man. And I would call your particular attention to Jojo, the dog-faced boy born 40 miles from land and 40 miles from sea." At this last you couldn't be sure but he was taking a laugh inside of himself, for his eyes twinkled. Us kids did imitations of him, and when trying to rattle a pitcher or a batter, we would bawl, "Beneath yon canvas we have the curiosities and the monstrosities." Or, "Look who's to bat. It's Jojo the dog-faced boy, born 40 miles from land and 40 miles from sea." And we learned, too, from the spieler, the barker, about the dime. The price of admission, ladies and gentlemen, is a dime, 10 cents only, the 10th part of a dollar. Buy your tickets now before the big rush comes. Don't crowd there, boys, don't crowd. I had a dime and a nickel in my pocket. With the dime, the 10th part of a dollar, I bought a ticket. I went in and heard the ventriloquist and his dummy. Will you spell a word for me, Danny? I'll try. What's the word? Constantinople. Why do you tell me you can't stand on an apple? I saw the wild man of Borneo, and I could say he was a sad little shrimp and his whiskers messy. The fat woman, the dwarf, the giant, they seemed to be mistakes God had made, that God was absent-minded when he shaped them. I hung around the midget and his wife, watched them sign their names to photographs they sold at 10 cents, and they were that pleasant and witty that I saw I had guessed wrong about them, and they were having more fun out of life than some of the men in the Q railroad shops. I stood a long while watching the giant and noticed that he was quiet and satisfied about things, and he didn't care one way or another where the people looked at him. He was so easy and calm about the way things were going that he reminded me of a big horse that didn't have to work and eats regular and never buys patent medicines. If a smarty asked, "How's the weather up there?" he might lift one eyebrow and let it pass, for he had heard it often enough. Nor did I feel sorry for the python. He may have been a man-eater, but he was sleeping as if he had forgotten whoever it was he had swallowed and digested. After a third or fourth time around, the only one I felt sorry for was the wild man of Borneo. He could have been the only lonely creature among all the freaks. The Oriental dancing girl certainly was no freak, an average, good-looking showgirl, somewhat dark of skin and probably a gypsy. She twirled, she high-kicked, did a few mild wiggles, and when it was over I heard a farmhand saying, "It's a sell." I thought from the way he talked outside that we was going to see a belly dance. Another farmhand saying, "Yeah, she didn't take a stitch off. It's a sell." Years later it came over me that at first sight of the freaks I was sad because I was bashful. Except at home and among playmates, it didn't come easy for me to be looked at. I didn't like the feel of eyes being laid on me. I would pass people on the street, and when they had gone by, I would wonder if they had turned their heads for another look at me. Walking down a church aisle between hundreds of people, I had a feeling of eyes on me. If 3 or 4 men stood in front of a store when I came along and one of them made some remark like, "Better hurry, kid, you're late," or, "Does your mother know you're out, son?" I didn't have the answers and walked on with the feeling their eyes were on me. This was silly, but when you're bashful, you have that feeling of eyes following you and boring through you. And there at the sideshow were these people, the freaks. And the business, the work of each of them was to be looked at. Every week, day by day, they sat or stood up to be looked at by thousands of people, and they were paid to be looked at. If some one of them was more looked at than any others, there was danger of jealousy on the part of those who didn't get looked at as much as they wished. Only the wild man of Borneo and the python seemed to be careless about whether anyone looked at them or not. I walked out of the sideshow with my nickel still in my pocket. I passed the cane stand where a man held out rings and spoke like his tongue was oiled. "Only 10 cents for a ring, and the cane you ring is the cane you get." I watched fellows throw one ring and quit. One stubborn farm hand paid 30 cents for rings and didn't get a cane and laughed he didn't want a cane anyhow. I walked on and later came back, and the man with the oily tongue was still calling out, "Only 10 cents for a ring, and the cane you ring is the cane you get." Now I saw a man ring a cane and look at it from end to end and laugh. I suppose maybe it's worth 10 cents. I stopped where a man was cheerfully calling with no let-up, "Lemonade, ice cold lemonade, a nice, cool, refreshing drink for a nickel, 5 cents, the 20th part of a dollar." Then in a lower tone, as if talking to himself, "Lemonade made in the shade and stirred with a rusty spade." I passed by him to hear a laughing voice, Here's where you get your hot roasted peanuts, those big double-jointed humpback peanuts, 5 a sack. I passed him by and still had my nickel. Then I came to a man sitting on the ground, a deep-chested man with a face that had quiet on it and wouldn't bawl at you. I noticed he was barefoot. I looked up from his bare feet to see his arms gone, only stumps of arms at his shoulders. Between the first 2 toes of his right foot, he held a card and lifted it toward me and said, "Take it and read it." I read it perfect handwriting, every letter shaped smooth and nice. It said, "I can write your name for you on a card for you to keep. The charge is only 10 cents. I looked into his face and I said, "I would if I had the 10 cents. All I've got is a nickel." I took out the nickel and turned my pockets inside out and showed him that besides the nickel there was only a knife, a piece of string, and a buckeye. He took the nickel in his left foot. He put a pen between the first 2 toes of his right foot and on the card wrote, "Charles A. Sandburg." Lifted the foot up toward me, and I took the card. I looked at it. It was the prettiest my name had ever been written. His face didn't change. All the time it kept that quiet look that strictly didn't belong with a circus. I was near crying. I said some kind of thanks and picked up my feet and ran. Away far along into December 30, 1926, the mother passed away. While in bed with pneumonia and a heart complication, she took a lead pencil and wrote on cheap tablet of blue-lined paper, on 2 sheets, a prayer and a meditation that she titled Souvenir. My heart is so full of thoughts and feelings, so great, so much to be grateful for. My heart, at times, overflow. Therefore help me to be strong and patient now in present struggles, for I am yet on the climbing upward path. But soon I shall go down in the silence. I can't read it. We gotta get that a little later after some coffee, maybe. And some Jack Daniels.